Hello and welcome back to HEMA Fight Breakdowns. Today I'm going to be breaking down my fight from Lynx Cup 2025, which was a bronze medal fight. And I'm going to be fighting Branden Zipplinger, who you might remember from the last video as the person who won the gold medal. So spoiler alert, I lose this fight. But it's still a pretty interesting fight to break down, not just because it's one of mine, but because we have a very different compare and contrast here to make between how I tried to handle Branden Zipplinger and fail, and how Sam tried to handle Branden Zipplinger and also similarly did not win. So right off the bat, what we're going to pay attention to here is Branden's very unique style of aggression and use of the ring and distance and tempo in order to maintain a dominant position. And one thing that's really interesting that happens during this fight is that I get into a pretty big points deficit. Now, in this particular rule set is a 2.1 point differential where cuts to the body are also 2 points, which means that you're never really able to get a huge lead. For example, I think at one point, Branden goes up by 4 points. That's really only 2 exchanges where I get a clean 2 points. But at the exact same time, it's worth pointing out that this rule set also has a very, very tight afterblow window, which means that in a sense, you almost end up in a kind of right-of-way situation. Not in the sense that attacks always get priority or parries always take priority, but in the sense that if you land first, chances are you are not going to be called on whatever you get hit by next. So there's a couple techniques that I try to use here that sometimes work and sometimes don't work based on this principle, and Branden similarly does the same kind of thing. So without more, we're going to get into the fight itself. Now, our first exchange is actually something of a goofy one. We do still have our little bit of a feeling out phase. You can tell right off the bat that I am being very defensive, but I'm being very defensive in a very particular kind of way. One thing, if you watch my other videos, you'll know is that I have switched to my left foot being forward, and what that has done is it has changed me, at least in my opinion, to a slightly more aggressive fencer. But against someone like Branden, I will still go back to my old defensive fighting ways, and I find that having my left foot forward doesn't really take anything away from me. As you can see from this particular sequence, I'm doing just as much shuffle stepping and back stepping as I normally would, and I'm doing a lot of it with my back foot. The reason I do it with my back foot is that if you don't know, the position to which you can move is always determined by the foot that moves first. So for example, if you're doing a step forward, you're going to move your front foot forward first and then pull your back foot up to match. Similarly, if you're going backwards, you move your back foot backwards first, then you pull your front foot back to match. So the reason I'm using my back foot to go backwards, sometimes before my opponent even comes forward, is because I'm just making 100% sure that while my opponent is coming forward, my front foot is going to be moving backwards, which is going to be the action that actually takes away all of my targets and moves my body actually physically backwards. If you try to speed up the process, like I'm doing, move that back foot first, you're going to find that your defensive actions are going to work a lot better. But in this particular case, Branden saw through my defensive actions and knew that I was going to parry hard on the first thing that he threw. So he comes in, he feints a high attack on his right side, and you can see I completely over parry. But the reason that I over parry so much is because I think that Branden is going to come in with a very strong, very aggressive first technique, and I've been prepping everything up till now to get ready for that. So I over parry really, really hard, and Branden throws his counter shot, and my front foot being out of the way actually saves my life. Because I initiated my back foot movement first before my opponent had really even started his attack, I am able to pull my body far enough away that Branden's feinted attack and his follow-up attack both are too short of range, resulting in him completely whiffing into the air. Now at this point, I recognize that my opponent has missed, and I decide to throw my follow-up attack, which is a short edge, kind of like shield house straight down onto the top. At the exact same time that this happens, Branden goes from missing a high line attack and then scoops up with a low line attack into my hands. Now, in this particular instance, one thing that we would like to talk about is right-of-way rule sets and the concept of tempo. Now, theoretically, under a right-of-way rule set where you had this kind of slow-motion footage, what you'd be able to tell is that because Branden had feinted his first attack, he gave up his attack priority in that exact moment, but then I didn't do anything other than parry. So after he threw his follow-up attack, if he had landed it, he would have had priority still. I would not because I didn't successfully parry. But after Branden misses his follow-up feinted attack, technically speaking, we kind of reset. And I am the one who then initiates the attacking motion by going forward and initiating the attack with my hands, which means that technically speaking, from a right-of-way perspective, I had the attack priority when I landed to his head, and then he did not when he landed to my hands. And what's interesting about this is that after the judges are done, they actually give 1 point to Branden, because in their minds, his missed attack probably, they either thought it landed or they thought that the follow-up just came in a little bit sooner than my follow-up attack. In my opinion, at best, this was going to be a double where I hit a high target, he hit a low target. But one thing to understand here is that when we have this slow motion footage, we're going to see a lot of things that judges just didn't see. And as you can see, based on how many times I probably replayed this by now, when you watch it fast, it's hard to tell what happens, but when you watch it slow, it's abundantly obvious. So give a little bit of credit and credence to the judges here, because they had a really hard fight to judge, and there were a lot of exchanges like this where when you watch the slow-mo, something completely different happens than what the judges actually saw. Now, for this next exchange, I'm going to do what I should have done in the first place. I'm fighting on the right, Branden's fighting on the left. I always forget sometimes that I know who I'm looking at and other people might not, so there you go. But the other thing about this particular exchange is that it really shows what my game plan is. My game plan this entire fight was to make sure that I got the first parry. And overall, I don't always like admitting the fact that I'm an extremely defensive fighter, but in this case, I think it was actually a pretty decent idea. Sometimes I feel as though I don't get aggressive enough, I don't seize the vor enough, I don't make other people respond to what I'm doing. But the simple reality of it is that I'm fencing my best when I get that first parry. And if I try to change up how I fence and how I use my feet and how I change my stance, I find that often I just don't do as well. So what I do instead is I try to emphasize my defensiveness. I try to put myself in a situation where defense is the best option in the given scenario, and I try to just force my opponents to get into a pattern of overcommitting. So as a result, despite the fact that in the first exchange, Branden threw a feinted attack and got just the wildest parry out of me in the first intention, in this exchange, Branden instead goes for just a single intention strike straight to the top of the head, likely thinking that I felt really bad about that big whiffing parry and wasn't going to do it again. But I do it again. So when Branden throws in his big strike over the top, I get my nice juicy cron parry on the left side, and then I throw a right spheric. And this is again where we get into a little bit of weirdness, because as this happens, one thing you're going to notice is that it's really, really hard to use a right spheric and zone out this left side of your head. The reason for that is that when your arms are open in front of you, as they are in a Zverkow, but they get stopped halfway, there's often this little area right here that just isn't in the way of a crossguard or a blade overall. And in a lot of ways, it's a consequence of the fact that when we Zverkow, we end up getting stuck on the first thing we make contact on, which 90% of the time is your opponent's hands, meaning that they can almost unintentionally throw their own hands up there, get smacked on the side of the wrist, and then in the process of trying to throw their own blade, shove your blade out of the way, opening up an even wider hole than was normally there. And that's more or less what happens here. I land my Zverkow. Immediately as that happens, Branden comes down over the top to try to get it, and in the process of levering his blade in order to throw his cut, he basically pulls my sword down past the top of my head, and it looks like he actually lands on the head, maybe a little bit on the hands at the same time. Either way, what's important is that I get credit for hitting the head, and Branden gets credit for hitting the hands in the afterblow, which means I get 1 point. But again, the reason I'm going over this is because this is just my overall game plan. I want to make sure that every single time Branden throws a big ballistic cut towards one of my deep targets, that I punish him for it, either by getting a really juicy parry or by just making him miss entirely by backing up out of the way. Now, I'm going to be skipping some exchanges because, of course, this fight was 17 exchanges and I'm not going to cover them all, but this next one is a little bit of a turning point in the fight. Namely that right up until now, we're actually pretty close in terms of points, but at this point, Branden is going to get a clean 2. And the reason he gets a clean 2 is because he does a very, very smart adaptation, which is knowing that I am going to be a very defensive fighter and knowing that chances are I'm going to eventually go for something deep of my own. He can counter this by using some pretty nice, almost boxing-like head movement, but also by just going for my hands and walking backwards. And this is really, in a nutshell, the whole dynamic of this fight throughout all the exchanges. every single time we come together, one of us decides whether or not one of us is going to be the one to go for a deep target. If we both decide to go for a deep target, chances are we both make it and we get no points. But if one of us decides to go deep and the other decides to go shallow, then the person who went shallow almost won every single time. And that's what we see Branden go for here. I decide to go deep. I throw a thrust towards, to my credit, exactly where his head used to be, at which point he ducks it to the side, gets real low, and throws a nice middle how to my body. Because of the particular position in which I was in, I am only able to then finish my passing step, wind my sword back down to try to parry it, which of course wasn't going to happen, and I end up looking pretty foolish and giving my opponent clean 2 points, which again is pretty critical because in this particular tight afterblow format, there isn't as much room to try to get those advantageous doubles, so you have to make 100% sure that you're landing everything you throw. Otherwise, even a slightest miscalculation or a slight miss can't be gamed out of the system by just, turning a miss into another attack and then, calling it a double. So I get punished pretty hard here for my deep attack, and it's going to result in me getting even more defensive. But as we can see here, Branden has a very, very clean counter to this particular situation, and you're going to see it come up again later. Now, this next exchange isn't exactly a turning point in the fight. It's just a relatively interesting exchange in the sense of how different it was when you watch it in slow motion versus how you watch it in fast motion and how it was judged. And so in this particular exchange, Branden is trying to pick apart my defense, and I am still swinging really hard for all of these defensive first intention parries. And Branden, through his credit, is doing what is now, I guess, a triple feint. He's feinting high on the right side, feinting lowish on the left side, and then winding all the way under to try to do a undercut to the bottom of my hands. But halfway through this sequence, I make a pretty intelligent decision to realize that my opponent is feinting a little bit too many times and to just go in and attack. So I throw a shield how right down the middle, but it is of course not quite in distance and I don't really make it to my target. The exact same time this happens though, Branden's undercut, which I think was intended to be an undercut with the vertical edge going straight up into the bottom of my hands, gets stuck in a really unusual way. Now, from what I can tell, when Branden went for this undercut, he was in a little bit of a thumb grip, and as a result, when he came around with the flat side of his blade turned sideways, and as he did his undercut, it was that flat side of the blade that got stuck and then bent. And what's really interesting about this is that when you watch this exchange in fast motion, what you probably see is what you think the judges see. It's like, oh, well, I guess at some point he threw a cut there and it got a little stuck in a glove and then it turned into a thrust, right? And that's not really what happened at all. When you watch it in slow motion, you see it get stuck pretty much right on the bit of guard between my hands, and then as he comes up, it bends forward, not just because of his upward motion, but because of my forward motion. And as a result, I end up just like manually bending his sword into a U with my hands. It's not a great exchange, and it's not one where, watching the slow-mo, you would say that anything of quality actually happened. But it's really interesting to point out because there's going to be, again, a lot of exchanges in here where when you watch the slow motion, you're going to see something completely different from what the judges saw. And in my opinion, the judges did the right thing here in assuming that there was no reason for the blade to be able to bend that far without making any kind of contact on the sword, at which point your mind goes right back to the intention that you saw Branden trying to do right before that. And it's like, okay, it was an undercut, got stuck in the hands. Clearly it landed something. They should give him a point. So not a bad call on the judge's side, but definitely an interesting one to watch in the replay. Now, I've skipped over a few exchanges in the middle, but for the most part, the point differential hasn't really changed much. I think Branden has going up from being 2 points up to now being only 1 point up. But this next exchange is another critical blunder by me, and it's a blunder for two particular reasons. One is that I throw a flat shield how, and no one should call that regardless of whether or not it lands. But the other critical thing here is we see another instance of Branden using this really crazy head movement to get his head out of the way when he successfully guesses that someone is just going to come in and try to throw something straight at their head. Now, as you know from fencing yourself, hopefully, in a tournament, you know that one of the most difficult things to deal with is someone who walks directly into action and always throws that really vertical strike right down to the top of your head. And the reason that's difficult is because it usually requires a really big windshield wipery parry in order to get rid of it, and there's a lot of things that someone else can do to you once they have that timing down. They can play with distance, they can play with timing, they can delay their attack and wait for you to miss your windshield wiper, and A really difficult position to be in. But Branden here seems to have found a really, really nice adaptation to this situation, which is to simply move your head so far off of the line and then to attack a different line as to make sure that if they do come forward and they do manage to hit you, chances are it's not going to be to your head, it's going to be to your hands that you got that far into the space. So what's the idea? What's like the overall goal plan here? The idea is that if you know your opponent is going to come forward with one of those vertical strikes, rather than trying to protect your head, move it to somewhere where you can more easily protect it with other parts of your body and other parts of your sword. So what happens in this particular exchange is I come forward, I throw my flat shield out. Again, it is flat and probably shouldn't count for anything anyway. But at the exact same time as this happens, Branden goes from a kind of cron parry to ducking his head underneath of his cron parry onto his left side and then throwing that left middle howl along that same line. And this is a really, really smart thing to do because he combines not just the head movement, which puts the head in a different position, but the fact that he can put his entire cross guard between his head and that vertical strike. Normally, in order to get your cross guard up to the point where it protects your head like that, you have to put it above your head, which is just not a practical thing to do. So by combining the act of moving your head lower and raising your hands and moving your head to the side and your hands to the side, you actually get a really, really nice defense out of this. And it's probably something that I'm going to try putting into my own fencing again, because at the end of the day, it makes a lot of real economical sense. One of the biggest things and issues when it comes to protecting your head is just the fact that it sits so high on your body that getting your hands up there is completely impractical. So it just makes a lot of sense to now move it somewhere else where it's easier to protect. So a really great exchange, a really great adaptation, and again, one in which Branden gets 2 clean points and really turns this into a dominant sweep for him. Now, at this point, I'm down 3 points, and I really need something to go well for me, and that's exactly what happens. I finally managed to pull off, at least in my opinion, the one clean time I pull off my game plan. Namely, Branden comes in with a big strike straight to the top of my head. I manage to cron parry it off to my left side, and then I throw a left Zwerk. Now, one of the aspects that makes this game plan effective is that once you land a cron parry, you can really throw either Zwerk. And for a lot of people, when they parry on their left side, their first instinct is to then Zwerk on their right side. And that makes a lot of sense. That's essentially moving the quadrant of engagement from your upper left opening to your upper right opening and reverse for your opponent, meaning that they have to take their sword from one side of their body to the other. And sometimes that's more than enough time to get them to screw up. But when you're fencing high-level people, sometimes you really have to mix it up, because a lot of times, once you're really good at fencing, you recognize that people often go in this left, right pattern, and you know that the second you have an engagement on the left side of your body, you now have to hightail it to the right side of your body to stay safe. And that's exactly what Branden does here. He feels the pressure on the left, or on his right side rather, and then immediately thinks, okay, here comes the right Zwerk, I gotta get under it, and he attempts to throw a left counter Zwerk. Of course, this does not work out, because by the time I am done my parry, I have already thrown my left Zwerk. It's a little bit of a duplirin at this point in a way, and I managed to land to the head very, very quickly. Also, since that Branden has thrown something on his left side, he left himself completely undefended because he essentially just guessed wrong. So he's undefended, he gets hit in the head, and most importantly, his left Zwerk kind of ends up just going meaninglessly to my hands. But another key aspect here, and the reason why I think I got the clean 2 points here and not a double with Branden hitting me in the hands, is because of how close his Zwerk was. One of the interesting issues, or advantages rather, with the left Zwerk is that it forces you to cross your hands. And when you cross your hands, you shorten them and you bring them much closer to your body. And one of the aspects of this that's kind of important in this particular situation is what it does with your right elbow. So when you throw a right Zwerk, your right elbow is all the way out there. It's all the way out in front. And it's a very, very open and obvious target. But when your hands are crossed, it's much further back. And as a result, you can see when Branden throws his left Zwerk, it kind of hits me right here. But given where this is, if I'm forward with my left Zwerk, it's jammed right up against almost where his shoulder or face might be. Meaning that your ability to throw a Zwerk out of that position is actually pretty limited. You're going to hit with the strong, you're not going to have a lot of great rotation, and most importantly, you will have just been hit in the head at the exact same time. So I got 2 clean points out of this. I don't know if that's necessarily a bad call by the judges, that they didn't notice or just thought that it wasn't good enough, that Zwerk that hits me in the arms, but either way, I've taken this from a 3-point game to now a 1-point game. So for this next exchange, and again, I've skipped a few, is pretty important, not just because something happens, because at the end of this, I believe nothing happens, neither of us gets a point, but particularly because what we see is a little bit of a failure point of one of the adaptations that I talked about earlier from Branden, namely his head movement combined with these middle strikes along the side. Now, when I talked about that, one of the advantages I said it had is that it, one, lowers the position of your head and raises the position of your hands. Now, if you're thinking about ways that you can counter that, well, one of them is to come in at a higher angle. And that's really what I am trying to do here with my particular strike. Now, when you watch my strike, what you'll notice here is that I have my right foot back, and when I spring off of the ground, instead of really going forward, what really more happens is that I almost jump with one side of my body. It's a little weird to describe it that way, but when you watch it, you just see my right foot kind of bounce into the air, and it takes a little bit of my hip with it. And the reason I do this is because of the other consequence of this little half jump, which is that it raises the line of my shoulders. Now, I've talked about this before, and it's 100% true in all cases. All sword fighting comes from the level of your shoulders because your hands are attached to your arms. There's nothing you can really do about it. But when you're trying to lever over the top or underneath or in any other angle from someone's guard, you measure the differences of that angle by the shoulders, not by the sword. And in this particular instance, what I'm trying to do is get over the top of my opponent's guard, which means I have to raise my shoulders to a higher level. Now, this is where we get back into Branden's adaptation. By lowering his head and doing this kind of boxing head movement, he's also lowering his shoulders a little bit. He also is doing so that he can raise up his hands to the level of his shoulders and more or less have his head be safe. But in this particular instance, because his hands aren't as high as the level of my shoulders, they aren't actually in presence to prevent anything from levering over the top of his guard and getting into his deeper targets. Now, the head movement still saves him in a lot of ways because when I throw my downward strike, I don't end up hitting the top of his head, as was my intention, and instead kind of hit towards the top of the shoulder in here. At the exact same time, Branden goes off to the side and tries to throw his cut, but one of the aspects of levering over the top is that after I have thrown my strike, my hands are now below my shoulders, and they're actually a little bit more in the way of my torso than they normally would have been. And this also brings up another topic of the relevance of making a body cut the same number of points as a head cut. In this particular instance, one of the difficulties that the judges had was determining whether or not Branden's strike hit my hands or hit my body. And in their ruling, it hit my body. Now, when we watch the slow-mo, it does look like it hits my hands, or maybe just like the deep part of my elbow. But at the same time, we don't actually have a great camera angle, and it could be that the tip does manage to make it all the way to the body, in which case they're going to give him credit for the thing that he hit best rather than the thing he hit worst. Because if something always hits the hands on the way into hitting you in the head, you don't want to call it a hand shot every single time. So again, this does result in a double and no points. But we see an interesting adaptation here where you can get around some of the instances of people using the ability to lower their body as a defensive measure by simply raising yours and countering them by going over the top and trying to lever down over the top of their guard towards their head. So for a little bit of context now in the fight, that last exchange butted right up until the last 10 seconds of the fight. And one of the rules of this tournament is that they will give you final exchange with no time limit, regardless of what the timer says, as a method of making sure that nobody is rushing in to try to get a point in the last 2 seconds because they only have 2 seconds to score. The idea being that everything's a little bit safer when you can just take this last exchange at your own pace, and it's okay if it takes 10, 15 seconds. So it does. And this is our final exchange. And in this final exchange, it looks to me like I get a clean hand shot. But, and this is one of the only times I'm going to do this, I want you to pay attention to what the judges throw immediately after this exchange happens. Trevor, who's on my right and a little bit behind me, throws a double head hit, which is a very interesting call. Frank, who's a little bit more in front of me and also to my right, but more importantly to Branden's left, throws a double hand hit. And when they go and do their little conference, what they end up calling it is a double hand hit. And I find this very interesting, not just because in the slow-mo we can kind of clearly see that's not really what happened, but more importantly because it helps you understand what goes through a judge's mind when they're trying to make a really difficult call. Now, what you probably can't really hear is the fact that there are 2 ringing sounds that happen when this exchange happens. And it's those 2 sounds that is really, in my opinion, informing the idea of a double here. And when you watch the exchange, it's actually really hard to tell where that second ringing sound actually comes from. But what happens here is that both myself and my opponent throw a middle strike straight across the middle towards each other's hands. And under normal circumstances, there'd be almost no reason, no logical excuse as to why our blades didn't just meet in the middle. So right off the bat, from a judge's perspective, this is extra confusing because it seems like both of our blades just kind of disappear in the middle where they should collide with each other, don't collide with each other, and then you hear a sound. And with that information alone, it's really tough to go off of. Now, specifically to the individual judges, what I find interesting is that Trevor, who is again to my right and a little bit behind me, threw the double head hit. And I think the reason he did that is because of the angle at which he viewed the perspective of the exchange. He's behind me and a little bit to my right, which means that he saw me swing across the middle and he heard that little bit of sound. But what he had the best angle to see was Brandon's cut that does look like it passes directly in front of my face. Now, again, in their perspective, when you hear two ringing sounds, you might think, oh, JW hit something here, but I couldn't really see because of the angle, but I know Branden came across the middle here, and I definitely heard something, so chances are that second sound that it made was it clipping the front of the mask, and that's not an unreasonable thing to think. At the exact same time, though, Frank, who has a completely different angle, likely saw 100% that I hit the hands on my swing, but again heard that second sound and saw that we were both coming across the middle and just said, double hands, because he couldn't really rectify the information that he had going. You can see also that they're both extremely nonplussed about having to make a call on this exchange at all, and they're both just not very sure of what happened. Now, what inevitably happens at the end of this is that Sean saw something that neither of the two saw, which is definitely that Branden maybe hit me in the hand, maybe he thought he saw it, maybe he only saw my hand hit and just wanted to go with his other two judges who saw a hit at all and didn't want to go with the head hit from Trevor. So he just said, okay, double hands, nothing done, and let's do sudden death. And again, as far as judging goes, this is a real tough one. This is a tough one because oftentimes the information that you get is going to be contradictory to reality, and sometimes your basic understanding of how fencing works can dig you a little bit of a grave. Both of these judges thought that their understanding of fencing meant that both of these people who threw these same strikes should have just hit each other, and there's really nothing else you can say about it. So I do get robbed of a point a little bit here, and theoretically it's also why I lost the fight. But again, we do still have one more exchange to cover. So that last exchange was final exchange, and we didn't get any points, so now it is sudden death, and the exchange has to be clean, which means that one of us can't get a head target and a hand target and walk away with that 1 point victory. It has to be clean, which means one light, one set of points, something for somebody, or nothing for anybody. And it's really crazy that that's the parameters of this particular exchange, because when you watch it, it actually doesn't look like a one light exchange at all. It looks like an exchange where we both just hit each other. But what's really crazy about this one is that the judges absolutely called it right on this one. And when you watch this back in slow motion, what you probably see, or maybe don't see so well, is that Branden has a ring guard. And one of the important aspects of the ring guard is that when your cross guard is horizontal, you still have these rings on the side that are going to protect your hands. And that's very, very key in this particular exchange, because what happens is Branden feints an attack coming forward. He throws it very non-committally. I parry it and immediately come straight down the middle towards the head. And I look like I get really, really close, but I don't actually make it. And the reason I don't make it is because I come straight down onto the ring guard, onto the left side of Branden's ring guard, which just barely, by like the measure of an inch or two, makes it a parry. At which point, Branden responds instantly by feeling the parry on his ring guard and then coming straight into my neck, at which point you see it land right about here on my collarbone. And that, as far as judging goes, would normally be an almost impossible thing to judge, but we got some pretty interestingly good judges here who, despite the fact that they might have missed something a little bit easy last time, have absolutely nailed this call. This is a call that 9 times out of 10 I would almost expect judges to get wrong because of just how close and just how fast it was, but they didn't. This was a clean exchange for Branden, and while I did come within maybe an inch of victory, an inch too far is nothing. So I don't get any points. Branden gets 2, and he wins the fight and the match, and then eventually the gold medal. So congratulations to Branden. It was a really nice fight, one where, especially once we got down to the bottom couple exchanges where things were really, really tight, things came down to just a very slight difference of intention and a very slight difference in adaptation. But ultimately, it was Branden's ability, in my opinion, to get offline, keep his head safe from behind his hands by moving it off to his left side, that kept him from getting a couple of really key exchanges where I might have gotten 2 points or 1 point on a differential in the afterblow. So great fight, great stuff, and a lot to learn from in terms of what kinds of things you can do to try to adapt to your opponent when they fight in a similar ways to how we're fighting. So that's going to be it for today. I'm going to have more videos next week, probably some more on Lynx Cup. I want to try to showcase some of the other fights, like maybe a Div 2 or one of the ERG fights, because I feel like I focus a little bit too much on longsword and specifically on the men's longsword finals, and I should really give credence to the other kinds of fencers who are at this tournament. I just want to say for the record, though, that the reason I tend to focus on these is because these are the ones that I happen to be there when I'm recording. So I'm going to have to rely on other people to record these things in order to get you that footage, but once I get it, I will make videos of it, and we're going to have a nice overall picture of how Lynx Cup really went.